thank you, Up2Us, for having me here, and it certainly is up to us, as we all know, and was demonstrated in 2017, that when people come together, when people are aware that something has to be done and do something about it, it makes a huge difference. And it made a huge difference across the 40th Senate District, including places as amazing as Putnam County, where they now have a Democratic sheriff, where they have a new town board member in Southeast, where people in Dutchess and in other parts of Putnam wish that they had put up Democratic candidates in 2017 because they would have won, not because they were just putting up lambs for the slaughter. So I'm very happy to be here, and I do believe that 2018 has the potential to even be a bigger year for all of us than 2017 was, in terms of this massive movement towards a correction in our federal, state, and local governments. And that is good for all of us. And one of the best demonstrations of that was exactly as Francesca said, those young people standing up and going out and making themselves heard. And in Florida, a week or so ago, students from Parkland went to Tallahassee. And Tallahassee voted in a way that nobody would have anticipated and passed gun laws. The biggest shame of that is that the NRA immediately sued the state of Florida on the age issue. So Florida raised it to 21, and the NRA immediately brought suit. Those kids are not going to back down. And they're going to be in Washington, and they're going to be in our backyards, and we should be very happy to know that they're out there ready to take care of us in ways that unfortunately we might not have taken care of them. And it reminds me of when I was a kid and what the older kids were doing to stop the Vietnam War. And when children move, when students move, the world seems to turn. And that's not a bad thing for any of us. So, this is about gun safety and the U.S. Constitution. And as we all know, there is great confusion when we talk about the U.S. Constitution, and particularly the Second Amendment. We understand that the First Amendment has limitations. There are limitations on how you can practice a religion in terms of slaughter. You can't sacrifice your son or your daughter to God. It's not legal. At one time it was. But there are limits. Freedom of speech. You can't yell fire in a crowded movie theater. There are growing limits on other amendments to the Constitution about property rights, about your ability to keep people out of your house with or without a warrant. So there are many things that have changed over time. But for some reason, some people, and it is a minority, believe that the Second Amendment is sacrosanct. It's not. And we know it's not because you can't own a bazooka. You can't own a machine gun. You can't own other weapons that are out there that could be used as defense, but they're not legal. So it is really a matter of setting the terms of what we can accept and what we can't accept that should meet the criteria for our communities and our nation. And we understand that there are some weapons out there that do extraordinary damage to people. They're not necessarily used for hunting, although some hunters will argue that they are. But the biggest problem that we probably face is that there are a number of people who are afraid and distrustful of our democratic system. And those people believe in their guts that they must have weapons in order to protect themselves from us and from our government. And them. They don't. I think that they are them. So, I don't know if they're protecting themselves from them, but they are definitely frightened. And fear and anger is something that keeps happening over and over and over. We saw it in the last in the 2016 elections, how the candidate, who is now the President of the United States, really worked at scaring people. And he's still doing that today, as was demonstrated in the race in Pennsylvania. He went there in an attempt to scare people out of voting for the better candidate. Yet, right now, it looks like Pennsylvania's doing okay. In a district where Trump won by 20%, right now Mr. Lamb is looking pretty good. So, it goes to show once again, when people mobilize, when Up2Us mobilizes, even for people in Pennsylvania, and Iris definitely sent out and posted a lot of stuff on making calls and being organized and helping, and I'm sure others did as well, and it works. It works when we do it from here, it works when we do it from there. It goes to show that we are united in ways that we might not have thought of ourselves as united. But what's very interesting right now, when Parkland happened, there was a lot of talk once again about hopes and thoughts and prayers. And our state senator, who will go nameless, because they say in every campaign school, never mention the name, tweeted. And what did he tweet? Just one line of scripture. No thoughts, no hopes, just prayer. It hasn't worked in any of the other instances, and it's not going to work now. There's been growing and growing pressure, and I salute to a large extent the amazing people that sit on this town board for sending a letter, or preparing to send a letter, to Senator Murphy. Almost.
You meant Chris Murphy, right?
Or Tim, or John. About somebody's phone. It doesn't really matter.
Background music.
She's trying to find it. So to send him a letter asking him to consider some of the laws that have been proposed in the Assembly and co-sponsor them in the Senate. Now, over the past couple of weeks since the Parkland massacre, there have been over 20 pieces of legislation passed in Albany. 5 or 6 in the Assembly, and 15 or 16 in the New York State Senate. In the Assembly, those bills that have been passed have focused on how do we stem the tide of violence, and 16 plus pieces of legislation that have been passed in the New York State Senate have exclusively focused on how do we make ourselves safer by building fortresses around us. So whereas the Assembly has passed a bill that would allow families and or peace officers to confiscate guns, going to a judge and getting a permission to go and confiscate guns from people who are deemed to be a danger to themselves or others. The Senate has passed legislation that says that every school in New York City, private and public, must have armed guards. There's a difference in that mentality. In the Assembly, they passed legislation that says if there's domestic violence, if you're accused of domestic violence, if you have a history of domestic violence, you can't have access to a gun. In the Senate, women will be able to testify outside the courtroom via television so that they don't have to risk being in the courtroom. So let's take people away from society, let's put people away, let's put people behind bars, let's put people in juxtaposition to the natural order of things, or let's find a way to make those places safer. There's a real different mentality there. And 15 or 16 pieces of legislation talk about never once removing guns, never once how to store guns, never once on background checks. All they talk about is how do we build stronger fortresses. They are willing to come up with money for better security in schools, not such a bad thing, but that's cameras and that's doors, and that's other things. We know that if someone is intent on doing something, they will find a way to do it. Parkland waited until basically kids were being let out of school. What are you going to do? Put up screens like they do now when a president comes to a hotel to go, so that you don't know where they are between the buses and the schools? I mean, there's only so much that we can do. We are not getting to the root causes of these problems. And if we don't find our way to the root causes of these problems will mount and mount and mount. The bills passed by the New York State Senate admit failure. They admit that there's nothing that we can do but build a fortress. Everybody should be armed. Everybody should have weapons, because that's the only way that we can potentially protect ourselves from those who will get weapons. There's this mentality that only bad people get guns illegally. And the truth is that many of the incidents that we have seen and witnessed time and time again, those guns were gotten legally. They weren't stolen. They weren't bought surreptitiously. They were bought because people had the ability to walk into a store and get those guns. And you have people that believe not only should they have access to guns, but they should also be able to have them concealed and carry them anywhere. So if you look at the progression of liberalization of gun laws and the mentality that guns actually protect people when all the science says that it doesn't, it's no small wonder that the United States Congress, through the Dickey Amendment, has banned the study of gun violence. Now, California has already passed legislation and is doing the study of gun violence at UCLA. In the New York State Assembly, they have passed a bill that would allow for a research facility to be in New York, based at SUNY. No such corresponding bill has been passed in the New York State Senate. Mr. bill, the first one that he co-sponsored, calls for anyone who goes with a weapon of mass destruction into a facility that holds more than 25 people will be considered domestic terror and punishable by death. It doesn't work on how that person got there in the first place. It doesn't work on prevention. Prevention is the one thing that we know that brings down the cost of everything and makes us all safer. The only piece of legislation that the New York State Senate even remotely resembles a preventative bill is that they're willing to pay $50,000 per school for psychologists to look for potential offenders. So they're willing to do that. If someone looks like they're a danger to themselves or others, they're willing to have psychologists up to $50,000 per school. Now, this is the group of people that tell us that they do not want to break the budget. They do not want to spend. So they're going to put police in every school. They've passed a legislation that says you can raise the cap on what retired police officers can make if they're in a school. So they can collect their pensions, which is fine, and they can collect a full salary for being in the schools. And that's fine if they're needed. But it's interesting that upstate schools, of which we would be included here, can request additional resource officers. New York City schools, public and private, it will be mandatory to have armed guards. We're talking about billions of dollars in extra money going out from the state to make what they say will be a safer school, when in reality there is no evidence, empirical or otherwise, that more weapons and more police officers will necessarily make this safer. And I can't stop remembering that on that Wednesday, I was substitute teaching in Fox Lane High School. And the bell rang. It was the last period of the day. I had a class of 9th graders on the 3rd floor of the building furthest from the main entrance, but the closest to where the buses were. So they went down those 3 flights of steps, and I went with them, and they went to the bus door, and I started walking through the school to where the teachers park. And as I'm walking through, my phone vibrated, and I looked, and it was Parkland. And by the time I got to the front of that school to enter into the teacher's parking lot, there was the resource officer. I got the chills because I realized that if someone was waiting where those buses were, how many students would have been killed before he could, in any way, shape, or form, make his way from one end of that high school to the other. And then I remember, many years ago when I ran a program in the New York City schools, I ran a program in Erasmus Hall High School. That was a school that had 5,000 kids. What could one officer, what could 4 officers, what could 6 officers do in a school on multiple levels with 5,000 young people? And how would you know the difference between one and another? We have to find ways of solving these problems without making these problems worse. And clearly, at this moment in time, the New York State Assembly has a much better vision of how to solve these problems than the New York State Senate does. And that's a crisis. Because right now, the only house in New York State that's controlled by the Republicans, which is the only party that has some kind of connection with what's going on in Washington, are like-minded. And that like-minded nature puts us at more risk rather than not. So as we look at the United States Constitution, the one thing that we know over time, even though some would like to not admit that it's true, is its flexibility. And that flexibility gives us the opportunity to say what the Second Amendment means to us in 2018, not necessarily what some of the framers of that document meant in 1791. And that's a huge difference. And that's what makes America what America is flexibility. Because I still remember, and some of you may remember, there was a congresswoman by the name of Nan Hayworth. And I remember Nan Hayworth coming to speak to a real estate meeting. And she started her presentation with, "I want you all to know that I am a strict constitutionalist." So I raised my hand. And I asked Nan, did that mean that she believed in the Constitution as it was originally drafted, that blacks were 3/5 a man, and that women shouldn't have the right to vote? Or did she also believe in the amendments to the Constitution? And which amendments did she think went too far, and which ones would she accept? And she just looked at me. And she looked at me. So I said, "Nan, I can make this easier. What's your opinion on the Declaration of Independence?" And there was a long pause. And she said, "I'll have to get back to you on that." And in Lewisboro, we have a library fair. And I was at the library fair manning the Democratic table with Alan. And Nan Hayworth was walking by, and she saw me, and she said, "Robert, come here." And I left the booth, and I walked over, and she said, "I want you to know, I support the Declaration of Independence." And I said, "This woman went to medical school?" It made me very nervous.
Well, just like Ben Carson.
Yeah.
Only he has a $31,000 dining room table. It made me realize that the ignorance, the lack of education, is our biggest problem. It's our biggest problem when it comes to guns. It's our biggest problem when it comes to opioids. It's our biggest problem in getting people to understand why their participation in government is so very important. Now, I didn't come to run for office because I ever wanted to be a candidate. In fact, I didn't want to be a candidate. But I set up a meeting to go meet my state senator because in Washington they were complaining about the Affordable Care Act. And my son is a schizophrenic and will never be able to be self-sustaining. And when I went up there, the senator had just miraculously left the office, so I had to meet with his chief of staff. And I went in and I said, what is New York State doing to protect New York State residents in case there is no more Affordable Care Act? Or if there are block grants for Medicaid and Medicare and SSI and Social Security. And their comment was, that's federal. We have no position on that. And I said, so you have no position on block grants? We have no position. You have no position on the Affordable Care Act? We have no position. I said, okay, the Assembly has passed single payer 3 years in a row. And the comment was, as long as we control this House, it will never see the light of day. And that is coming from the office of someone who sits on both the Health Care Committee and the Mental Health Care Committee. How can someone who sits on those committees have no position? And then I see, with the gun crisis that we face, which is a health care crisis in every way you look at it, no position. No position, no position. And when I walked out of that office, I walked out with the woman who went with me, and she said, I'm really glad that you pushed on health care, because yesterday I was diagnosed with cancer. And as much as they don't care about your son, they don't care about me either. And that was the first time I thought that maybe we needed to make a change. She asked me if I would run, I said no. I said I would help find someone who would be a good candidate. And then I went home and I had dinner with my son. And I started to realize how my eclectic background, having done a wide range of very, very different things, would be really different in Albany. So even though I had worked in Albany, even though I had studied a lot of the stuff that goes on and worked in Washington for 2 majority leaders and for the DCCC, I first started to think about the possibility of challenging this guy who has no policy and no position. And every single time one of these kinds of things happen, whether it's Indian Point, whether it's Parkland, whether it's women's rights, we're confronted with the same thing over and over and over again. Reactive policies, not proactive policies. And all those bills that were passed, 16 of them in 2 weeks in the New York State Senate, are reactionary. They are not proactive, they are not positive, and they will not solve the problem.
I'd like to thank Robert Kesten for coming to you. Up2Us is very happy that you all came out tonight to participate in one of the democratic benefits of having a town hall. So thank you for coming.
Thank you.